Welcome to the Daily Word, verse by verse. Grab your Bibles and follow along as we study the book of Galatians. Keep in mind, I am using the Holman Christian Standard Bible. So if you're using a different translation, the read is different, but the message is the same. Also keep in mind that these Daily Word, verse by verse studies are uploaded to my YouTube channel, BP, The Bible Perspective. That's BP, The Bible Perspective. So like and share these videos and subscribe to BP, The Bible Perspective. Okay, we're in chapter 4 and we are in verse 21. And Paul is rebuking them because he's pointing out to them that these Judaizers, these false teachers who have been poisoning his message to them. And we can tell by the tone that the Galatians were falling for these false teachings. That you guys are falling for this. So now, verse 21, he's going to give them another illustration. He says, "Tell me, you who want to be under the law, are you not aware of what the law says?" Right? So this is the whole point right here. These Judaizers were telling them that you had to obey the law of Moses. In fact, if you go back to Acts chapter 15, they use the phrase, you have to keep the law if you want to be saved. Okay? Verse 22, "For it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by a slave woman and the other by a free woman. His son by the slave woman was born according to the flesh, but the son of the free woman was born resulting of divine purpose." Now, here's the interesting thing about it. You go back in Genesis, God promised Abraham that he would have a son. God said, no, from Sarah, barren body, I'm going to bring a son. Well, they got impatient. So Sarah says, hey, go into Hagar, our slave, and produce a son. And right there you kind of see, way back then they had surrogacy. Surrogate relate things right there. Which, by the way, always is bad. Well, he's going to give the story. He's going to use this story to illustrate a point. Right away, Sarah realized this. Oh, this was a mistake, because all of a sudden now the slave was looking at her some kind of way, right? And Sarah will go, wait a minute, she's being disrespectful here. And so in the end, Sarah said, she's got to go when the child came of age. And by the way, when Isaac was born, the son Ishmael was 13 years old. And both of them were mocking. And Sarah go, they gone out. She kicked them out. So, Paul is using this illustration here to say, okay, verse 24, these things are being taken figuratively. The women represents two covenants. One covenant is from Mount Sinai, which bears children who are to be slaves. This is Hagar. Hagar stands for Mount Sinai in Arabia, which corresponds to the present city of Jerusalem, because she is in slavery with her children. Now this is interesting, because back in John's Gospel, one of the things the Pharisees said, we are not enslaved. You're a slave right now to the Roman Empire in a sense. He says, but the Jerusalem that is above is free, and she is our mother. For it is written, be glad, barren women, you who never bore children, shout for joy and cry aloud, you who were never in labor, because more of the children of the desolate woman than of her who had the husband. Now this is quoted from Isaiah, the book of Isaiah. Now, it is interesting that he mentions New Jerusalem. If you want a further reference of that, go to the book of Revelations, chapter 20, 21, 22, and you see a beautiful picture of the new city of Jerusalem. And all of this comes by God's grace, and that's the whole point. There's law. So now verse 28 says, now you brothers and sisters are like Isaac, are children of promise. At that time, the son according to the flesh persecuted the son born by the power of the Spirit. It is the same now. I'm going to back to that. Remember, you had Abraham, who in his flesh had a child with his slave. And God says, no, I'll bless him, but because he's your son, but that is not the heir. One of the most interesting things, too, that at the end of Abraham's life, before he even died, it was interesting. It says that he gave gifts to his children. After Sarah died, Abraham had at least 6 more children, even besides Ishmael, by his second wife after Sarah. He gave them gifts, right? Probably great gifts, but the heir was Isaac, and Abraham was always careful to say, no, Isaac is the heir, down to who he was to marry, who he was not to marry, how he was to be treated always. This is the heir. So he says, verse 30, but what the scripture says, get rid of the slave woman and her son, for the slave woman's son will never share in the inheritance with the free woman's son. Now this is interesting, because if you go back and read the Genesis account, it almost seemed like, man, this is hard. This is cold-blooded right here, what Sarah did. And God said to Abraham, I want you to listen to her. Why? This is your mess in the first place. It was never designed that you would have this co-heir between Ishmael and Isaac. It was never that way. It was a mess-up. But God is bigger than our mess-ups. That's another interesting story. Verse 31 says, therefore, brothers and sisters, we are not children of the slave woman, but of the free woman. So now, he makes the illustration that the law of Moses is what? Of the flesh. If you're trying to work the law of Moses, then you're trying to work it of the flesh. That's why he says, cast out the bond slave with her son. And they were not to be heir with the bond slave, with the slave was not to be an heir with the promised son, which is Isaac. So everything about Isaac's life, that God blessed Isaac's life, was, based upon God's promise, not the law. So Paul uses this illustration here to show how that you cannot use the law, that by living the law, if you're going to submit yourself to the law, you're taking yourself outside of the grace, outside of the promise. So all these illustrations hitherto that he has been using, right? All of these illustrations that Paul has been using is to show you cannot by your own human effort. Now again, when we get into the next chapter, Paul is really going to lay into these Judaizers. He's going to have some of the strongest language that you see. But again, even to this day, Christianity is still poisoned by theologies that employ good works, that you must do something. Think about this. If you feel so guilty because you don't go to church on Sunday, that you feel like you're not in God, that in some kind of way you're disconnecting from God, that's man's religion. This would be a good example of this to apply. We are children of the promise. God has given us so much more. And what he's saying to them is that here you are. You're the heir, but you're putting yourself as a slave. You're making yourself a slave. He says, God has given us so much more than that. And that includes, again, remember these elements of the world, these religious systems of the world. The beggarly elements of the world. All these religious thoughts, by the way. All right, chapter 5 in the next video. I will see you then.